Let's talk about Persia. So for a while, and maybe this is still the case, Persia was perhaps the most fun country I've ever played, or I had the most fun in the game where I played Persia. And the things that make Persia pretty unique are that it's big but not too big. It starts off relatively weak despite its bigness, but not like unovercomably weak in the same way that the Turkish guys up north, the hordes like Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan do. And you start off kind of with an immediate rivalry against your overlord, the Timurids. And I just think it's fun because there are very few countries that you can break off at the beginning of the game that don't start off in the beginning of the game, that actually start off decently strong and put you in a not terrible position. I mean, Persia's, well, we'll get to this. So firstly, let's talk about Persia's start. So as I said, you start off pretty big, but not huge and not super strong. There are a lot of directions you can go, but the first thing you have to do, of course, is defeat your overlord, the Timurids. And that is not the biggest challenge, as you can see in this game, or as you will see. I almost immediately got both the Ottomans and Ming to support my independence. And when I declared war, it took them a while to show up. You can also, of course, try to get people closer to you to help you, although no one will be as strong at the beginning of the game as the two guys I got. You'd probably try for someone in the Indian subcontinent. So I think the start is, it's fun to have that immediate hurdle to jump over, and then after you do that, one of Persia's greatest strengths is it's kind of at the center of the world in a sense. You're surrounded by completely different directions to go in, so you can go to India, and that's kind of its own game going in there. And I did not do that really when I played Persia. I went westward more. And the nice thing is you have some walls, some buffer zones between you and the huge dangerous guys of the game, namely the Ottomans. So you have some time to take over most of the Middle East before you have to deal with the Turks. However, their start does, it's hard, not in the sense that your military starts off really weak, because your military starts off pretty good, in a pretty good state, but just commerce and declaring war on your overlord is hard. I mean, it takes away 3 stability. You have to win the war, of course, to just have your own, to be able to play the game normally. When I played as Persia, I actually ended up going bankrupt. I think that's the only time that's ever happened to me. And I don't remember exactly why. I think commerce is a little difficult to get yourself established, and your independence war can just leave you in such a bad state in terms of rebels and unrest and instability and the like, that it can be a little frustrating to get your footing as Persia before you can start steamrolling people. So for that reason, I think I'm going to give their start a 6. It's fun and it's challenging, but to me, it's just a little frustrating. Now, in terms of events and ideas, Persia actually does have some pretty good ideas. I think partially they're probably rewarding you for having to overcome your overlord and then pursuing the game from there. You do have 5% discipline. You start off with 10% morale and 10% cavalry ability, although you will hardly be able to avoid cavalry in the early game as Persia. There are things like caravan power, which are less useful. So their ideas are pretty good. Their events, they also get a lot of special events, being a nation with a historical Zoroastrian population, and at a conflict point of Sunni and Shia Islam, as well as just Persia. Persia is a historically very important area, and so they got a lot of events surrounding that and the Shahdom. However, there's nothing particularly special about their ideas and events. I mean, they have things that suit Persia, but it's not like the ideas and events kind of jump out as being like a super important part of the experience. So I think I'd give it a 6.5 out of 10. Now, I think overall playability is where they really shine, and this is not necessarily to say that their end game is super fun, because they do, of course, like everyone else. But particularly Persia, since your biggest fights happen around mid-game when you have to confront the Ottomans or China. In the late game, after you've had those kind of ultimate climax challenges, it can become a little more of a steamroll fest. But basically up until the last 50 years, Persia is incredibly fun. You just have so many different directions to go to. You have kind of reach areas. The Ottomans, of course, are your first reach in terms of ability, easily being able to break into that area. And then, of course, you can go to Africa, which is slightly easier. You can break into Europe, which is definitely a long reach. but perfectly possible. And there are a variety of avenues you can do that. You can go up through Russia, which is actually pretty close to you, or you can go through Anatolia. And of course there's China on the other side. So you kind of have the two rich parts of you have the rich part of Asia and the rich part of Europe basically just outside of your grasp, and you really have to work pretty hard to get them. And as I've said before, you're strong. Early to mid game, you're strong and you're pretty big, but you're not overwhelmingly so, which means you almost always have rivals until you eventually surpass the Ottomans. I mean, immediately you have people like the Timurids, of course, at first, and then Karakoyunlu, and you can go to the Mamluks, you can go to the Indian people in the Indian subcontinent, often rival you approximately. You have the Turkish tribes up in the north who are a little difficult to deal with, and you have so many different commercial avenues open to you. After the early game commercial difficulty that I have had multiple times, you have the Indian Ocean, you have the whole Arab world, Middle East area. You can commercially push into China or into the South Asian Sea, and of course there's ocean everywhere when you're Persia. I mean, you're not quite like Malaysia or Spain or someone who have ocean combat as part of their core gameplay, but Persia is kind of second tier in terms of how much you have to use the sea to your advantage. And I had a lot of fun with sea-related activities, whether commerce or battles, when I was playing as Persia. So for that reason, I think I will give Persia, for their overall playability, a 7.5 out of 10. As with the start, there is some frustration in there, depending on when you kind of get hit by your stability and commercial calamity, which I feel is almost inevitable as Persia. I think it's pretty difficult to avoid. But really, they're fun. The fun in playing Persia is concentrated very heavily towards the mid game, as I said, until you remove the Ottomans or Ming, depending on which direction you go, or you can go both directions as your kind of final challenge. Now, in terms of role-playing, I think Persia is a lot of fun. Persia often comes out when it's as played by the AI in games where you're playing as someone else, but it rarely ever does particularly well. Usually it sometimes gets a little big, like takes over most of Iran, and then just kind of crumbles as the Timurids did before it. So it's fun to be able to take a country to heights that the game itself doesn't really bring that country. Persia is, of course, at least to me, a historically incredibly interesting area, having been the birthplace of empires for thousands of years and being something of a religious melting pot during its history. But at this point in the game, or this point in history, around the 15th century, Persia had not really seen a large empire of its own for hundreds and hundreds of years. So it's fun to be able to reignite that flame and take it farther than any Persian empire had before. Of course, there's no formations you can do as Persia, although I think the breaking off of the Timurids kind of makes up for that, because it's still a tag switch in a sense. You're creating Persia by yourself. The game doesn't feel like Persia is just there to be taken for granted. So for that, I'd give Persia a 7 out of 10 for role-playing. And finally, of course, we have to stick visuals into here. So Persia's color it's more interesting than that Prussian bilge gray, but green is a controversial color, and I'm not entirely sure how I feel about it. I think Persia's green really lands it at a squat, perfect 5 out of 10. It's not a good color by any means, but it's also not a bad color, and it's interesting. There's some depth to it. So yeah, tell me what you think of Persia in the comments. I had a lot of fun in this game, just kind of exploding out. I rated it less highly than Brandenburg in almost, or maybe every category. That's kind of trying to be objective, because I really do think that Brandenburg, for the average person, might be more fun to play. I'm less interested in Europe than I am in Asia and the Middle East, which is why I think I just had a lot more fun in my Persia game than I did in my Brandenburg game, even though Brandenburg was a fun game to play. Thank you very much for watching this Rate That Country episode 3, and I will see you on the next video. Bye-bye.